Hello everybody. Today we have the privilege of having none other than Professor Graham Oppy with us. Professor Oppy is an Australian analytic philosopher specializing in philosophy of religion. He authored books like Atheism, The Basics, Ontological Arguments and Belief in God, Naturalism and Religion, a contemporary philosophical investigation, and many more. Professor Oppy engaged in debates with distinguished philosophers like William Lane Craig, Edward Feser, Richard Swinburne, and others. Public audience knows Professor Oppy for his defense of naturalism and atheism. Professor Oppy, I'm delighted to have you as my guest, and thank you for making time for our discussion.
Thanks for inviting me.
One thing that really interests me about your work is that it is really striking that all of a sudden, unexpectedly, you claim that arguments necessarily is not the way to go when deciding about choosing the big pictures. Rather, we should look at the theoretical virtue of metaphysical theories. And this is not the method with which the, day-to-day theist versus atheist debates go. So can you give us the rough sketch of what this, approach of choosing the metaphysical theories amount to?
Okay, so I think that when two people are having an argument about a particular proposition, they can easily lose sight of the fact that there's lots of other things that they disagree about. And so if you're trying to model what the participants, I'm imagining just a two-person argument. If you're trying to model them, it's much better to model them by theories than it is to model them as stating an argument, because that gives you a clearer view about what's actually required for there to be any meeting of the minds in the conversation. I mean, that's one way of sort of stating the kind of big picture idea. Is if you think of two people arguing, I guess one of the oppositions that they might argue about is whether there are any gods, and we can use that as the example. Whether there's any reason for either of them to shift their positions depends much more on the theories that they've got and in general when it does on what the particular people say to one another. Of course, it's possible, there's all kinds of considerations that come up. It's possible for you to make me change my mind just by telling me something. If I think that you're in a position to know, I'll just believe what you say. But when it comes to this question about the existence of God, that's a very unlikely scenario. People participating in these discussions, especially philosophers, already know that there's a wide range of different opinions. People believe in different gods, none at all. And assertion is not likely at all to be a way of making progress.
Okay.
One thing... Oh, you go.
Yeah, I was wanting to clarify that. So when people come into arguments, they come with a form of pre-theoretical, pre-ontological understanding of world. They have an a priori paradigm with which they understand and approach problems. And you don't think that, all of a sudden a syllogism or an argument is going to be of such high power that they are going to all of a sudden, change their whole worldview or a whole paradigm. So it's better to evaluate the paradigmatic approaches instead of, putting emphasis on, one, let's say, one striking / eureka type, syllogism that would, make a massive change, for example.
It's certainly possible for an argument to give you work to do. So if your view is inconsistent and I give you a demonstration that it's inconsistent, you've now got work to do, because having an inconsistent view is to have a suboptimal view in a way that's really devastating, I think.
Yeah.
So it's not that argument can't do anything. The kind of more general point is that you have a set of beliefs, but you don't know what all the consequences of your beliefs are. You haven't tested them all out. There may be consequences that you haven't noticed that really matter to you. So if we're having this kind of cooperative conversation, it will be useful to you if I point out to you that you're committed to absurdity or contradiction or something like that. Let's assume now that contradiction is guaranteed to be a bad thing, right? So, and it might be that eventually leads you to make really big changes to your worldview. It depends what the nature of the contradiction is. One way of understanding those arguments, the way I like to think about them, is they're saying, look, here's a set of inconsistent propositions. Here's a set of propositions that are jointly inconsistent. If you're committed to all of them, you better do some thinking. And what turns out is, if you're a theist and you are committed to all of them, you'll give up one of the more minor things, and you'll hang on to all of the big ticket items. You'll hang on to the idea that God exists and God's omniscient, omnipotent, perfectly good, and you'll give up whatever the linking proposition is, that there's no limits on what non-human being can do, or a good thing eliminates evil as far as it can, and you'll tweak those a little bit. Like, there are logical limits on what non-impotent being can do, or a good thing pursues the best possible balance of good over evil, and that doesn't mean it eliminates evil altogether, and so on. Right? So I think that the way that arguments play out has always been like this.
Okay.
When you, no matter what sort of arguments you're trading in, and it's a kind of myth that people.
So it's always a clash of big pictures as opposed to the isolated, deworlded syllogisms. So any debate regarding God is a debate about the competing big pictures.
Not necessarily. People might misunderstand what you can realistically hope to do when you get into these kinds of conversations. But what I think, and maybe it would be better to draw back from talk about big pictures and so on, and just think about the fact that people don't have isolated beliefs. They have network of beliefs. And when an argument's given that picking on a particular proposition, if I give you an argument and you want to get me to accept a particular proposition, there'll be a whole lot of other things that I would have to revise in order to pick up that proposition.
Right.
It's very unlikely that your argument is going to give me a reason to do that.
Okay, so you need to so you need to sell me the whole network of your worldview, instead. Yeah,
that's right. So, but it's also the case that when we're doing philosophy of religion, what we should be trying to do is to exhibit a big portion of our theory, so that people can look and see, okay, what are the merits and the disadvantages of these particular theories. I have a view about what's the best way to evaluate the theories. And especially kind of ideally, if we idealise a whole lot and talk about big pictures.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to
conversation.
And you of course your argument is that, well, the naturalism as a metaphysical theory is a better theory than the theistic one. And in your book, Atheism, the Basics, and in your other books, you list the reasons of why you believe that a naturalism as a metaphysical theory is better. And your method goes on to suggest that, well, one way of approaching this would be to say that we're trying to minimize our ontological, epistemological, and general theoretical commitments. But on the other hand, we want to maximize our explanatory scope. And so it's like, having the least amount of commitment, but having the maximum amount of explanatory scope. And if we compare, having this in head, and if we compare two competing theories, we're going to find out that naturalism explains everything that theism explains, but it has less commitments, less theoretical commitments, less epistemological commitments, and therefore it is a better theory. So can you elaborate on that, and then I'll ask the questions that I prepared for it.
I think you did a very good job of explaining what the if you want to call it an argument, what the argument looked like. Of course, I don't think that this is an argument that ought to persuade theists to change their views. I don't think that it's a successful argument, but I think it's the best you can do.
But you're not, as I'm aware, you're not in the business of, evangelizing people into atheism, if I understand correctly, right?
No.
Okay.
No, I've got no interest in doing that.
Right.
But I do think, when I think about this, I think about the best versions of theism that I've come across, and I think about my own version of naturalism, and I think about evaluating those with respect to simplicity and some depth of explanation of data. I think that naturalism comes out ahead, and I think that that's a reasonable judgment, sort of rationally permissible judgment to make, but I don't deny that it might be rationally permissible to make other judgments, right? So if somebody like John Rasmussen says that he goes through this procedure, and in his view there's a certain kind of Christianity that he thinks scores better overall, I don't think he's being irrational when he makes that judgment, right? I certainly disagree with him, but I think that it's a matter for judgment. It's not like this was a very simple argument. It's built up, depending on which of my writings you focus on, it might fill up 100 pages to get the argument without putting anywhere near all.
So what I want to do then with this, with this method of comparing metaphysical theories, is to see what is the standard by which you compare the sort of epistemological virtue of metaphysical theories. It seems to me that the standard clearly is a form of principle of parsimony, explaining more and more with less and less. So would it be fair to say that your fundamental principle with which you evaluate metaphysical theories is the principle of parsimony, or Occam's razor, or principle of simplicity? How would you like to term it, or I missed the target altogether?
I wouldn't call it simplicity, because it could turn out, and indeed it does, that the best theory is very complicated. It's important that it's a trading off of two things. You want to minimise commitments, but you want to maximise.
So why?
And so there's a kind of sweet spot that you want to hit. So how to motivate this? Well, suppose you have two theories that are equal in explanatory, but one of them postulates more things. You've got no reason to believe in those extra things, because there's no explanatory work that they're doing. So it's reasonable that you should want your theory to be as simple as it can be, consistent with explaining a decent amount of stuff. On the other hand, if you've got two theories that are equally simple, and one of them sort of provides satisfactory explanation of things that look like they need explaining, but doesn't go on to provide elaborate explanations of all kinds of things that it would be quite proper to think are unconnected, they're mere coincidences, right? Then you don't want that theory either. You don't want a theory that postulates all kinds of stuff in order to explain coincidences and so on.
Right.
So you should. So the idea that there's a kind of sweet spot here seems to me to be very intuitive.
But
and
yeah,
that's when Occam formulated his principle. In a way, that was how he put it was: the theory should be as simple as you can make it, consistent with explaining everything that needs to be explained.
Right, and the reason why I wanted to stress Occam is because when I had a history philosophy the philosophy of history class, I wrote my paper on Occam and the idea of the principle of Occam's razor. And when I read the first-hand sources written by Occam, he never calls it razor. Rather, in Occam's formulation, it is a form of what he calls a principle of economy. economy as in trying to do away with excessive ontological categories. This principle was formulated, if I'm not mistaken, when there was a form of clash between nominalism and a form of Aristotelian realism, when we want to do away with the extra ontological categories, which do not add much explanatory power. But you probably would agree that a form of a principle of parsimony was formulated before Occam, but although differently, and then there was other types. So this type of a form of tendency of philosophers towards theoretical minimalism, but on the other hand, an expanding of the explanatory scope is something that philosophers strive to. But my question is, well, which might be a form of childish question, but why? Why is minimalism good? Like, why should we care about minimalism? Why?
Right. So I tried to answer that question before, but so I'm a bit worried that I'll repeat myself. Right.
I understood what you said before, namely that if you have two competing theories and one explains everything that other does, you just don't need to explain it with more there's no reason to add more principles to it if I can do it in the same success as the other can. So it's just there's no reason to add excessive commitments. That's okay.
And I guess the other thing is, if you there's no end to what you can postulate. So if you want to start talking about epiphenomenal things that have no causal effects on us, you can fill your theory with them, but it's not. There's no virtue in doing that because there's no data that they're connected to. So there's no explanatory role.
All right.
Proper explanatory role.
So I think I'm catching up. Yeah.
So there's a bunch of reasons why a kind of sweet spot is what we just kind of naturally think that we're aiming for.
All right. So I think now I'm catching up with you. So to summarize, there's a form of the bound asymmetry thing where, there is no upper bound to theoretical commitment, but there's always a lower bound. And it's better for us to strive towards that lower bound. Did I get it?
Yeah, something like
okay.
That, I guess is right.
So,
of course, it's not fixed because there's a question here about what the data is, but as we acquire more data, it may well be that the simplest acceptable theory will be more and more complicated as we go on. That's the possibility.
Yes. So to ask a couple more questions about the principle of parsimony then. So generally, principle of parsimony is known to be effective in empirical sciences. Generally, people know it from the empirical sciences. However, you extend and universalize it to metaphysics and epistemology. It's not just empirical sciences. And why do you think it's because I've read a couple of papers which argue that actually principle of parsimony is not that effective when it comes to epistemology and metaphysics, to other disciplines other than empirical sciences. What do you have to say about that?
I guess I don't see why that would be the case. Why, in any discipline, should you postulate more stuff than you need to do the explanatory work that needs to be done in that discipline? And there's nothing in the principle in the empirical sciences that stops people from constructing theories and see how they go. And so extending the principle into philosophy doesn't stop people from philosophical theorising. It's just that when it comes down to the question about what should you believe, I'm assuming for the moment that people actually have beliefs in philosophy, then it will be a relevant consideration. That seems to me. there's no virtue in developing theories, it seems to me, that don't explain anything.
Okay, so then it would be fair to say that the principle of parsimony doesn't necessarily limit theoretical commitments. It's just when we know that we can explain the same stuff with the same effectiveness, we just don't need to postulate more commitments. However, and right now I want to explore schools of theistic apologetics, which might pose some challenges, and I'm interested at how you are going to respond to them. So one somewhat popular argumentation that is becoming somewhat popular on internet and on some Discord debates is I don't know whether you are acquainted with this, a form of transcendental argument, which says that, well, actually theism has a better explanatory depth when it comes to accounting for the transcendentals, that is the set of principles that work as preconditions of knowledge. So the transcendental argument, as I understand it, goes on to suggest that, well, we have all those presuppositions that are necessary for intelligibility, such as, space, time, number system, laws of logic, properly basic beliefs. And, naturalism is sterile when it comes to justifying or accounting for the unity of those transcendentals or preconditions of knowledge, whereas theism wins because it can account for the universality and validity of those transcendentals by pointing to the idea that God is who officiates the validity and universality of those transcendentals. I think that is the summary of this school of apologetics, and what is your reaction to it? Have you ever encountered this the presuppositionalism, or are you aware of it?
I'm not really familiar with it, but I don't see how you're going to get more theoretical unity out of making an extra assumption, the assumption that there's God, right? There's in your theory, there's going to be a whole. So let's start with the naturalist. Perhaps the naturalist has to postulate some primitives here. So maybe, for example, it's a primitive in the theory that there's a spatio-temporal universe. So you've got space and time as primitive concepts in the formulation of the claim that there's this spatio-temporal universe. And then it may be that you've got some theory about space and some theory about time, and we can imagine that you can axiomatize your theory of space, so that there'll be some bunch of principles about space and there'll be some bunch of principles about time, from which all of your knowledge about space or all your knowledge about time can be recovered. Now let's suppose we go to the theists. Are they going to be able to compress those theories of space and time? I don't see how. The best that they'll be able to do is to say God wanted these principles to apply, or something like that. You can't unify the principle further without actually just being able to move to a particular axiom set than the one that the naturalist has already got. So I'm just completely sceptical that there's any affordance of unity that you can get out of a postulation of God. And there are costs, because there's all these properties that you're going to be assigning to God that the naturalist juxtaposes aren't instantiated. Does that make sense?
So I think that from what I listened, what they're trying to establish is that that they have a form of justification for the universal validity of the preconditions of knowledge. So they would ask a question like, well, how do you know that the principle of identity or non-contradiction hold in all places and in all times? You can't know that because you do not have access to the, you don't believe in God, and for example, God would necessitate or would account for the universal validity of laws of logic and of the other transcendentals that are necessary for us to be for the world, for us to be intelligible. So, what would be your response to that?
So it's an interesting question, isn't it? Amongst logicians, there are paraconsistentists who deny that there's a law of non-contradiction. They accept that there's a range of cases in which contradiction should be rejected, but they also think there are cases where there are true contradictions and you should tolerate them. And although this is less common, there are people who think that you should reject the law of identity as well. Again, just like with contradictions, for the most part, violations of the law are a bad thing, of the alleged law are a bad thing, but there are cases where you should just tolerate. Suppose there are exceptions to the law of identity. Now, what to say about this, right? If the paraconsistentists are right, then there is no such thing as a universal law of non-contradiction.
Okay.
And likewise, if a tiny number of people who think that there's no universal law of identity, the same thing is going to apply. What I think we do with these cases is they're part of the theory, and we assess them in the same way as everything else. We see what you need in order to make best theory that explains all the data, minimising your commitment. And so I think that it's kind of up in the air whether it's even true that we know that there are no true contradictions.
But is it mandatory for us to know that laws of logic are universal and universally true in order for us to claim intelligibility or in order for us to claim knowledge?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Kids claim knowledge without any knowledge about the laws of logic.
But I guess
there's no problem about being justified in claiming knowledge without having any insight into logic. The kid knows that there's a squirrel in the tree, and they've got no idea about modus ponens. Doesn't matter.
Yeah, but I guess the way they conceive is that those laws of logic are laws of thought, as in a form of metaphysical laws that are, that are ingrained in your mind, as in laws that cannot be violated, or laws that are there even if you know about them or not. It's what make knowledge possible, or cognitive, or reliable cognitive processes possible in the first place. It's not how you view logic. What is the nature of those three fundamental laws? Are they actually constitutive laws of mind or laws of thought?
I don't. There's a lot going on here. And one question is about whether there are necessities of some kind, whether, for example, in your theory, you're going to have to hold that certain things are necessary. And I'm quite happy to go along with that. But I don't think that the determination about what necessities are going to be built into your theory is something that's arrived at a priori. It's just part of the process of theory construction. It's arrived at a posteriori. So I guess that's one part of the answer. On the question about whether there are laws of thought, that seems, I don't know, in some sense maybe there are. Laws of thought that could be mundane things like this. Don't think about things unless you have to. Don't clutter your mind with trivial stuff. Right? There should be some purpose to your thinking. Right? That could be a law of thought.
But
and
non-contradiction
then
is not.
that would have a kind of universality, right? You can't really make sense of the idea of there being an evolved organism that wastes its resources on things that are of no consequence to it. Right. So what I've got in mind here is logic tells you that anything that's a logical consequence of something that's true is itself true. So we can start with raining. It's true that it's raining. Well, it's true that it's true that it's raining. True that it's true that it's true that it's raining. I can go on forever, and I'm producing a whole lot of truth, but it's a complete waste of time, right? So the law of thought would tell you, don't do that.
Okay.
Right? Even though it's a law of logic that whatever follows from what's true, whatever is the logical consequence of what's true is itself true.
Okay.
So the idea that there's some connection between laws of thought and logic strikes me as quite a bizarre thing. I mean, there's a whole lot of rules you might think of for directing thought.
But those
logic. They aren't rules of logic.
Right. So the way I understand laws of logic is that they're laws that govern propositions or sentences that have truth value. So what I encounter is that when people speak about law of identity, well, A equals A, they sometimes, consciously or unconsciously, talk about that law as if it is a law of physics. Namely, well, can stone be a non-stone or it's as if they're talking about an actual stone not being able to be its negation. But what does law of identity actually cover? What it is a law of? That would be my question.
I guess the right way to think about this is to think about logic. So what's a formal logical system? In particular, think about predicate calculus with identity, because then you can kind of start to make sense of what identity's for. So in the predicate calculus with identity, typically you have three axioms that give you reflexivity, symmetry, and transitivity for identity. So for any x is x, for any x and y, if x is y, then y is x, for any x, y, and z, if x is y and y is z, then x is z, right, where the isn't there or all isn't of identity. Now, you might think that you need more for identity than that, but at least from the standpoint of the sort of logic with identity, that's what you've got. And there's a question about domain to which this logic applies, but any domain to which it applies will be one where you don't have violations of those laws.
So then you wouldn't say that the universal validity of those three laws of logic is something that we necessarily have to account in order for us to have reliable sense data. This is not.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think that your ability to perceive the world really doesn't depend on your having any theory about identity.
So the presuppositionalism say that no, of course you do have a reliable sense data. Well, because those laws are in action, officiated by God. It's just you don't realize or recognize it, or you don't want to recognize it. But if I then proceed to ask you to justify those preconditions of knowledge, then you wouldn't be able to, because non-God worldview cannot justify for the preconditions of knowledge, because then it would be circular or question begging or self-defeating.
So it seems as though if you really want to push in this direction, all you have to say is that there couldn't possibly be violations of laws, right? These are just necessary truths.
Again, I didn't catch it again.
A way to go, and then that won't be problematic.
Okay, that would be problematic for the naturalism.
I don't see how it could be problematic, right? There's this question about the accounting, if we're thinking about simplicity and we're thinking about, in particular, the theoretical simplicity, which you think about is maybe in terms of the compactness of axiomatization, there's going to be no difference in the compactness of the axiomatization of the two theories. It's not like a theory that's got God in it somehow gets to do away with having as a primitive reflexivity for identity.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I don't want to spend much time with it. It's just, there is this idea that in order for you to, well, since you think that, one purpose of metaphysical theory is to have explanatory depth, then it should probably also account for transcendentals or for the preconditions of knowledge. And then the idea goes that, well, naturalism cannot account for the universal validity of preconditions, and theism can, by pointing that, the God did it, basically.
Right, but that it's not clear that how the God did it's got anything to do with it's necessary that anything's identical to itself. Right. If you think that's necessary, then it seems to me nothing does it. Necessity is a kind of rock bottom. If I tell you that something's necessary and you ask me, but why? You're kind of missing the point, right? Because what's necessary is so no matter what, nothing could have made it otherwise. So in particular, it doesn't need God to make it so.
And do we know, so would you say that we know that principle of identity is necessary or universally valid, or is it, undeniable?
Okay, so this depends now, right? That was why I started by talking about paraconsistency, right? Because there's this question, right, about whether actually we know those things or not. Right? That's a live dispute amongst philosophers. But let's pretend that we do know it. Then fine. There's nothing tricky to explain here. If we know it, it's because it's necessary. If it's necessary, there's nothing further to say to explain it, because it couldn't have been otherwise.
Okay, so it could, yeah. Is it true that those three fundamental laws of logic are in action when day-to-day conversations are happening? So when my mother is asking me to bring her water, is there a principle of identity involved in that somewhere? Can we say that the principle of identity covers that the meaning of water that she has in mind, that I have in mind, should be identical to itself, or without that the communication would be impossible, or those laws of logic have nothing to do with that?
I'm not sure. So, that particular example is interesting. So there are some people who think that when you and I communicate, we actually don't have exactly the same concept, and the words that we use don't have exactly the same meanings. But there's enough overlap that we can talk to one another without misunderstanding. And so there's a question about whether your mother's water concept and your water concept are exactly the same or not. Perhaps, a bit more chemistry than she does, and so there's, your water concept is richer in various ways than hers. That doesn't stop you from communicating about, bring me a glass of water, but it will make a difference maybe when there are other things that you say when you're talking about water, and she just looks at you blankly and what? Because actually your concepts just aren't the same.
So when she says water, and when I understand this water, there is a reminder left when these two concepts of water are subtracted, but the similarity is enough for me to make that operational. I can basically go and bring the water and she's satisfied. But
one way of thinking about this is going along with your use of the word water is a theory about water, and that theory can be more or less complicated. It doesn't have to be if you sort of collect all the people on the planet and you take the intersection of all their concepts of water, it's not empty, right? It could turn out that intersection is empty, it seems to me. But maybe, even if it turns out that it's not, it might turn out to be too thin to sustain conversations. It's, who knows, right? We're talking really about questions that are kind of empirical questions for linguists and psychologists.
And to circle back, so what does the principle of identity doing here when someone's telling me to bring them water? What is the purpose of principle of identity? Is it true to say that, well, you need the principle of identity in order for you to understand when someone's asking you for water, because water has to be water and not water? Or that's completely bogus?
So that just seems wrong. When my children were little and I asked them to bring me a glass of water, I knew full well that they had no understanding of quantification theory and the other things that you need to state the laws of identity. No problem. Right?
So
it's not operating in any way in their understanding or in your understanding when all you're doing is saying, bring me the glass of water.
Yeah, so this whole idea about laws of logic being some form of metaphysical laws that determine the self-sameness of entities is not a correct theory.
I don't think so. That seems really weird.
Yeah.
It's as if, suspend the operation of the law and things won't be the same as themselves. What are you imagining? What could it possibly be? Right? We're talking about something incoherent here. Okay, so I think that the best way to think about this is to go back to mathematics and think about doing simple mathematical proofs. Very often, if you're kind of formalising your mathematical proof, you'll want to write down things like, for any x is x, right, and then derive a contradiction. You end up with A isn't identical to A, and you've got a contradiction now from the, because you can get A is identical to A out of the law. So the utility of the talk about identity and the idea that we've got these laws of reflexivity, sensitivity, symmetry is partly in the construction of mathematical proof and then in formal disciplines more generally, because it's not just mathematics, but things that look a bit like mathematics, like game theory, where you do proofs. You're going to need to appeal to these things, and in fact, in metaphysics too. So if you're talking about causation and you think that the causal relation is so actually the causation is not going to be a good example, but you might pick some other relation that has similar formal properties to identity, so you can do a kind of partition into equivalence relations, and there's all kinds of stuff that you can prove about equivalence relations and so on. That's what the users that talk about identity and the idea that there's a law of identity is. That's what we actually use it for.
If we touch the other ones, the excluded middle, for example, what would you say is the purpose of excluded middle in day-to-day argumentation?
It'll be the same thing. So if you think that you can formalise arguments for and against the existence of God in predicate calculus with identity, or we don't even need identity, we don't even need predicate calculus, we can do it in propositional logic since we're just talking about excluded middle, there'll be cases where in order to formalise your argument, you'll appeal to excluded middle. On the assumption that you and the other people have agreed that we're in a domain where classical logic applies, because it might be that you come up against people who are intuitionists, that they won't accept excluded middle, and in that case there's no point trying to give them an argument that starts with the assumption of excluded middle. And yeah. That's kind of important in philosophy of religion if we're talking about infinity, because infinity was the kind of thing that got the whole intuitionist stuff started in the first place.
So what I want to clarify now is that you use the word appeal, and it tells me that your understanding of laws of logic now is different, because when you say appeal to law of excluded middle, therefore it follows that those laws aren't like laws of physics, because so the laws of Newtonian mechanics are in action, whether you appeal to them or not, or whether you recognize they are there and you are subject to them. Laws of logic do not have the same ontological status. It's not that they are there determining your argument, determining your line of thought, the same way laws of physics or chemistry or biology determine you or your.
Okay, so that's interesting. I mean, there is the laws of Newtonian mechanics are not really laws. They're kind of rules of thumb that apply in a certain domain. Obviously, they don't apply if things are too small and moving too quickly. There is a question about the universality here. On the scale that we exist at, where you can ignore quantum relativity, then what happens perhaps is in accordance with the laws, but even that's not clear, right? There are people like Nancy Cartwright who would certainly deny that the laws do any determining when it comes to us, and in particular, you have to worry about free will at this point, right? If people have libertarian free will, then there's no determination by law, by physical law of what they do.
So then to rehabilitate my question, the basic forces then, such as electromagnetism, gravity, well, they are definitely in action in order for me to exist, right?
That's certainly true.
Yeah. Yes. So the laws of logic do not have to be in action the same way the four basic forces are, in order for me to have a reliable thought.
They couldn't be, because they don't do any governing. I mean, if you think
they don't do any governing.
If you think of the power, if you don't like laws and you talk about powers, right? There are certain powers that have sway. So, electromagnetism, gravity. There's no powers of logic that have sway over the universe.
Right?
That might be a good way to say it.
So those laws are not some laws of metaphysics that govern the, ontological parameters of universe. That's not what they actually are. Okay, because most times in usual debates, those laws are presented as some form of metaphysical absolutes, and I had some form of skepticism towards such, and you seem to justify my skepticism. They are not some metaphysical ground rules. That's not what they are.
I don't think so. I mean, it is true that you're not going to get it. Let's forget about the intuitionists and the paraconsistentists. You're not going to get violations, but it's not because there are powers that are stopping you. It's because it's outright impossible, right? There is no alternative.
Oh, okay.
You don't need anything to ward off impossibilities. Impossibilities simply are not going to happen.
Yeah, what type of impossibility are we talking here? Because there are clearly contradictions that that are meaningful. They are contradictions, but they have meaning, and we can think them. So it's not like law of non-contradiction prevents contradictions to exist. As a matter of fact, in order for us to know that law of non-contradiction exists, we do have to have the capability to recognize that there are, in fact, contradictory statements, or form of self-defeating statements. So you wouldn't say that law of non-contradiction. Yeah.
Okay, so that's true, right? I can write down a proposition that's contradictory. I can write down something that would violate the law of logic.
Yeah. Oh, all right.
That doesn't mean that there are contradictory objects in the world, or that objects instantiate contradictory properties in the world, or anything like that.
Yeah. So yeah, but you can
once you've got logic up and going, right? You formulated the law of non-contradiction. You can formulate instantiations of the law, and you can know that those things are just false.
Okay. So I think I'm done with the questions about metalogic and presuppositionalism, and we can move on. So next thing that I want to explore is the more popular apologetics that is more academic than the previous one. Now, since William Lane Craig, who you have debated, has successfully defended his rendition of cosmological argument and teleological argument, I'd like to know your general thought about the efficacy of Kalam cosmological argument and its potential power to prove or let us arrive at Christianity or a particular theistic worldview. Since William Lane Craig begins with somewhat less committed arguments that there is a cause to the universe, and then he follows up with saying that, well, that cause has to be this, and this, and then biblical God fits that description, and then and then he infers more and more. So, what is your general understanding of Craig's cosmological argument, and what do you think about the efficacy of it?
We'll focus first on the initial syllogism, which has as its conclusion that there's a cause of the existence of the universe. So I think that if you're a naturalist, you're definitely not going to accept the conclusion. You're not going to think that there's a cause of the existence of the universe. If cause is understood in a straightforward way, you might think that there's an explanation, because you might think that the universe exists of necessity, and so why does it exist? Because it has to, right? So it's not that you're ruling out that kind of explanation, but you're not going to accept there's natural reality and it exists because there's something else, something not part of natural reality that caused it. That's, in my view, that's antithetical to naturalism. So I think that if you're a naturalist, you're going to object to the conclusion of the argument. So that takes us back to the premises. So there are two premises. One of them says that the universe began to exist, and the other says whatever begins to exist has a cause. Now, if we understand the second premise just to mean that the past is finite, so it's, the universe has a finite past, right, then the first premise will be whatever has a finite past has a cause of its beginning to exist. Now, suppose you think that the beginning of the universe is necessary. That's consistent with its past being finite, but you're certainly not going to think that it has a cause. It doesn't need one. If it couldn't but have existed, then there's a further cause for that would be completely unnecessary. And if you're a naturalist, you think there's no such thing. So you're just going to reject the first premise. It's not true that whatever has a finite past has a cause of its beginning to exist, and the universe is the one counterexample to that. Right? That would be a kind of straightforward naturalist response.
That would be a response for the first premise.
If you come that far with me, then the rest of the argument's irrelevant, because we haven't got to.
So the first premise is everything that begins to exist has a cause to its existence. Now, so I want to, before I ask you some follow-up questions, and I might even ask you to repeat yourself once more, but I want to clarify some ground concepts here. So when we talk causality and something having a cause and the universe having a cause, although in most conversations people don't actually force each other to define what they mean by cause, I still want to ask that question. So when we have such a conversation, what is a cause? What do we mean when we say, well, something has a cause to its existence, and then universe has a cause to its existence? So what do we have in mind when we use the concept cause?
I mean, that's quite a tricky question. So maybe what I will talk about is what I think of as necessary ingredients in the story, but I won't try and give you an analysis of causation because that's hopelessly controversial.
Necessary ingredient.
So there's this question about what things can be related as cause and effect, and one tempting thought is that what gets related by cause and effect are events.
Events?
Events. So I'm the movement of the cue causes the motion of the ball when the cue strikes the ball on a billiard table. Right? So there's an event, the striking of the ball by the cue, that causes a subsequent event, the rolling of the ball down the billiard table. Right? So one thought is that you have, at its root, causation is the relationship between events. That doesn't mean that it isn't also a relationship between things. There's a relationship, a causal relation between the cue and the ball, but it's in virtue of the events. The ball just by the cue, the cue roll, and the ball rolling down the table.
I just want to tuck in one question in there. So, does not that characterization necessitate some form of segmentation of how we understand the process to go? So you said, well, I'm playing the billiard and I use the cue and I hit the ball, and now it's as if you came in and you constructed walls in between events. As in, there is the process A that leads to process B. So, well, why should I follow you in that segmentation of temporal events? What if it's just one straight flow of events instead of instead of succession of blocks, as form of mechanical blocks?
So that won't matter. And we can imagine partitioning this as fine as you like, and we can imagine it, if you like, being literally continuous. And there's a question about the world, whether the world's continuous or not. But we can. It still won't.
But if it's continuous, then
to separate out the movement of the cue, the point, which maybe is slightly extended, where there's an interaction between the tip of the cue and the ball, and then a later point where there's no longer an interaction between the two, but the ball's rolling down. And we can think about this, if you like. We can describe it as a continuous process. I struck the cue ball. If you're going to go that way, one way to think about causation is that it's what relates. It's the relation that unfolds as time passes. Something like that. So if you think about the state of the universe at a given time, right, and make that as small as you like, and then think about the state of the universe at later times, and one of the causes of the state of the universe at later times is the state of the universe at earlier times. So there's a causal relation that relates history, something like that. And we don't have to, the way that I've now described it, you don't have to think of it as partition. You can just think of it as the changing of the state of the universe.
So the way we understand causation in this case is that if A causes B, therefore it means that B would have never happened without A, or B's existence is indebted to A. So A is the necessary ingredient for B.
So I'm certainly not supposing that it's sufficient, because causation might be indeterministic and then it's not going to be sufficient. So if there's a necessitation relation, it's certainly not going to go the other way.
But, okay.
There are cases where you might think that it's not necessary either. I mean, there are cases like causal preemption, where one thing gets in and causes something But if it hadn't, there was another thing coming that would have caused it as well, and so it's not necessary. So it doesn't look like it's necessary for the effect. Like we both throw stones at a window, we're both on target, but my stone gets there first, so my stone breaks the window and yours doesn't. The breaking of the window is going to happen anyway. And there's a debate amongst philosophers about these kinds of cases and exactly what you should say about them. And it's like everything that we're talking about is way more complicated than we can do justice to in a short conversation.
So two questions. So I throw a stone at a window and it breaks. And every time I do it, it breaks. Every time my friends do it, it breaks. The natural intuition is that, well, you throw a stone in a window, and if it is heavy enough and if window is not protected, it breaks. So the throwing a stone at a window causes it to break. So I have some from human question. Isn't the addition of causal principle to that temporal events where all throwing a stone at a window, the fact that that event or that action is always followed by the action B, adding a causal link between these two events, doesn't that add something additional to it, or it is already there? It's just we are recognizing
Yeah. So Hume notoriously thought that perhaps the mind was adding something in this case, and philosophers disagree. I'm inclined to think it's just something that's already there.
Okay.
In the world. And
that was unexpected. So you think
what I'm inclined to think is that there are kind of things have causal powers. Those causal powers get exercised. I kind of balked at talking about laws, and maybe I shouldn't go this way.
So
I'm happy to do it.
So I'm kind of surprised that you believe that. So causality is a property of universe itself, and it's not just our intuition.
That's what I think. I think that things have causal powers. It's nothing to do with our observing. There's a squirrel sitting underneath a tree. The tree branch breaks, falls on the squirrel and crushes it to death. There's a causal process.
But so what I'm
and it's got nothing to do with that.
But what I'm having a trouble with is like that. In order for us to conceive that as a sequence of causal events, we need to. I'm circling back to it. I understand it, but it's as if there needs to be some form of partition of events. It's so. Like, where is this moment when the event A causes event B? What is the precise second in which the magic of A causing B takes place?
So if you think about events, right, they're spread out over time, and so what happens with my example with the tree? There's a rot that gradually sets into the tree branch over a long period of time. But there comes a point where the branch snaps and the branch falls, and in the case that I'm imagining, kill a small furry animal that's on the ground underneath. Now, there won't be such a thing as the precise instant at which the small furry animal dies. That's something that takes a period of time. Just as it took some time for the tree branch to fall from where it was to where it ends up, and it took a much longer period of time for the branch to become rotten, and so on. But all of this is causal.
Yes, and this is causal, and what I'm pointing is like in order for us to believe in that, we need to at first envision world as composed of events and things, as opposed to just continuous processes. So you want.
So I'm happy with that. I mean, I think that probably it's good to. 'Cause, 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 If I could, I would have an ontology just of things, but I don't think that's possible, right? So I think that you need things like states, events, processes. There's a bunch of other things that you should have in your ontology in order to do justice to the world. But one thing that won't disappear is things, objects. So the first premise is whatever has a finite part has a cause. That's roughly the way that we're going to understand it. So I think that there's a counterexample. This isn't true. The exception is the universe. The universe has a finite past, but it doesn't have a cause, and there's no problem about that, so long as you think that the initial bit of the universe or the origin of the universe is necessary, which is what I do think. Because necessary things don't need causes.
So naturally, what would be the response to this? Just like, how do you know that it's necessary?
So that would be a kind of weird question, because we're just comparing two theories here, and you tell me your God's necessary, and I ask you, how do you know? And unless you're Brian Lefter, you'll just say, come on, that's sort of ground zero in my theory. It's just one of the things I'm committed to.
Okay, so positing necessity is perfectly fine.
Yeah, it's expensive, right? It's a theoretical cost every time you do it. Okay. And when we're comparing theories, right, that's on the,
so naturalism.
It's the debit side of the ledger, right? But the theists have already got it if they've said that God exists of necessity. And so I'm just making a naturalistic view that's parallel on that point. It's not more expensive for the naturalist; it's the same cost, and we pay it.
So I think that the initial answer that you gave me about the evaluating metaphysical theories is now starting to click. So it's like, well, you also have theoretical commitments. It's just when we are making a trade-off, yours are less than the theoretical commitments of theists. It's because most of the time when atheists present their worldviews, it's as if they don't believe. It's as if they don't have any commitment that resembles a commitment of their interlocutor, let's say. But now it's like, well, yeah, of course you have theoretical commitments. It's just we need to evaluate which commitments let's say, which theories have minimal commitments and therefore the max. So yeah, you have a commitment, but it's not as heavy as the commitments of a theist.
So that's my view, and of course there'll be theists who disagree, but yeah, that's my view.
Okay, so another thing about about Professor Craig, and we can move on. You had a very interesting debate with him about the nature of mathematics. So the debate comes so to provide a rough sketch. So Eugene Wigner wrote a paper titled, if I'm not mistaken, "The Unusual Effectiveness of Mathematics in Explaining the Universe." William Lane Craig then constructs an argument to suggest that, well, the reason why mathematics has this, bizarre, strange, mysterious power to, sit down on a piece of paper, not knowing much about the universe, and work out equations, and all of a sudden it so happens that you arrive at an equation or some mathematical entity, and then you find out that, actually it maps onto a reality. And the best explanation is that, well, God constructed the universe based on mathematical principles, and that's why we humans can work out those equations and then retroactively find out that, well, those equations actually correctly describe the universe, and therefore God had therefore mathematics is not causally inert. It's not causally disconnected from the basic fabric of universe. God constructed the universe on mathematical principles, and you object to that. Can you give me your your feelings about that debate and this idea? Or was my summary of Craig trustworthy or?
Your summary's fine, but you can guess what I'm going to say. We've already got this postulate about the necessity of the universe in the version of naturalism that I like compared to Craig's version of theism. If mathematics applies to the universe, then it does so necessarily, so there's no mystery, right? There's nothing left to explain. It couldn't have been otherwise. Now, you might think that sounds dodgy or a bit unsatisfactory, but it seems to me that once you've bought into the idea that all the possible world share history with the actual world and diverge from it only because indeterministic chances play out differently. Once you've bought into that, there's no further work that you need to do in order to explain why the universe has the mathematical structure that it does, on the assumption that indeterministic, the outplaying of indeterministic chances can't change the structure of the universe. So it's kind of straightforward.
So
there isn't anything unreasonable about the effectiveness of mathematics.
So what is it?
What might be surprising is that we've been able to discover some of the mathematics.
Discover. So you're using the word discover.
To discover the mathematics is come to have knowledge of it.
Was it there? So I know the problem of the question that I will ask right now, but I will still do it. So was it there before we discovered it?
Sure. So let's suppose that let's pretend that Einstein's equations correctly describe the structure of space. Right. Well, before Einstein, those equations still correctly describe the structure of space. It's just that we didn't have the equations yet. Right? Space didn't change when Einstein developed his theory. It remained the way that it was before. And if space has a structure that's described by Einstein's theories, then it had it before Einstein.
So there is no unusual effectiveness of mathematics. And
not according to me.
So what is it about what Craig claims about how you can sit down and work out equations and you can stumble upon the one that correctly describes the universe? Like, why is that possible? What makes it possible?
So there's an argument to be had about the extent to which that's really possible. So there's a couple of cases where physicists have claimed kind of to make interesting discoveries about the universe from the armchair while, working out mathematics. I'm very sceptical about that. I think that there are lots and lots of cases, and you only have to go and read in the physics journal to realise just how much stuff physicists write that make empirical predictions about the universe that turn out not to be true. And so if you cherry pick a couple of cases like Dirac's prediction for positron from the kind of working out of equations, you're just ignoring the fact that there's all this other stuff that people have been doing for hundreds of years now where it doesn't have those consequences. And if you accept that there is a mathematical structure there, occasionally people are going to happen on some of it in the armchair. That's not surprising, but it's consistent with the data, right? That most of the time that people do that, they aren't coming up with truths about the universe.
Okay.
Most physical theorising is false. Yeah, so this is very hard I think quite hard to make sense of. But consider the claim that there's a prime number between 16 and 18. there is, right? That means there exists a prime number between 16 and 18, and many of us are just prepared to say that. So it looks as though our ordinary mathematical ways of talking commit us to the existence of numbers. But what are numbers?
Yeah, right? Exactly.
Can I go and visit in Tokyo or on the moon, or do I have to go further? Well, no, you're not going to find them anywhere in the universe, right? They're not inhabitants of space and time, and so you get this idea that put forward by Platonists about mathematics, that there's this realm, an abstract realm, where the numbers hang out. So that's where it comes from. People who don't like Platonism, like people like me who would rather be nominalists, think there's no such place, right? And that in that sense, there aren't any numbers.
Where do they come from, then?
So what you have to do is go back and talk about numbers, and see what we're doing with it, and try to understand that talk in a way that doesn't commit you to supposing that there are things, numbers, that are being talked about. Right? Now, there's various ways that you can do this, and Craig is a fan of one or more of them. He's not a realist about numbers because he thinks that the reality of numbers would be a threat to divine aseity. So,
divine what?
Not a real aseity, God's kind of independence of everything else and being right. If there were other necessary existence, then God wouldn't be Lord over all, because the numbers would have a kind of independent sovereignty, which he thinks would be an affront, right? So Craig himself is no realist about numbers. It's probably easier to talk about numbers because you can have collections of things and you can ask how many of them are there. And you have counting in most cultures of, 1, 2, 3, or maybe in some cultures you don't need much beyond that. Once you've got started with this, with counting, right, answering the how many questions, so that, and we can understand this in terms of collecting things together into piles. So you've got 3 apples and 3 oranges and 3 cherries. Do we have the same number of things in each pile? Yes. How many do we have? Well, we'll call it 3. Right? Now, that gives you basic numbers. But then you can, and this is where abstraction comes in, you can think about or talk about this. So the numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then you can think about patterns in them, like that every second one is divisible by 2 and that some of them are prime and so on. And then once you've got a bunch of patterns, you can ascend another level of abstraction and talk about patterns of the pattern and so on. And that's really what I think is going on. And we pretend that the numbers are objects because it makes this business of abstraction easier to manage, right, easier to talk about. But what we're really doing is just picking up on patterns in the world. Now, you might think pattern itself is abstraction, right? But in the case of the numbers, I started with collections of concrete things, apples, oranges, cherries, whatever, stones. We can count anything. And then abstraction comes in when we think about pattern in that.
Got it. So when you speak of collections, do you have some form of proto-set theory in mind?
I wasn't thinking about that. I mean, because I wasn't thinking that you had to suppose that these were sets and that you had to have some kind of rudimentary set theory. I was thinking that, we've agreed, the 3 of us have agreed to have dinner, and each of us is going to.
Yeah, but what if a culture?
I come along with an apple for each of us. You come along with an orange. Someone else only brings 2 cherries. They've done something wrong because you don't have to think about that in terms of sets. In any highly theoretical sense.
So you are putting forward a completely operational understanding of numbers. Operational as in that allows us to talk about the same things when we want to get a 3 apple, for example.
Right, but then the stuff that comes out of this, once you adopt the pretense that 1, 2, 3, and 4 are not just labels or the kind of sizes of collections, but we adopt the pretense that they're objects, that opens up a huge domain of activity, mathematics, right? That turns out to be enormously useful for all kinds of things. But if you want to understand what's going on there, you don't have to postulate any numbers. Right? You just have to understand what you just called the operational basis, where it grew from. Right? And that's not the only operational basis. There's another thing because arithmetic's only part of mathematics. If you think about geometry, the biggest single factor, I think, in the development of geometry was inheritance. People had land that they wanted to divide evenly between offspring. And that raises all kinds of interesting questions that themselves then lead to abstractions and so on. You start talking about geometric objects. That's where your circles ultimately come in, squares, rectangles.
Yeah, well, it's a very interesting thought, but and a cultural anthropologist would force you to account for the specificity of where and in what particular context did geometry come about. So why? So because in the form that we know it, it's mostly ancient Greek one, but the inheritance of land did happen in other cultures too. But it happened because it's like there is an
that's right. But the same thing's true about counting, right? Counting's universal, but the development of mathematics happened in some cultures and not in others. Right? So you can find it, I guess, in ancient China and ancient India, and a bit later in ancient Greece, but you don't find it in. So it's not like there's an assumption here that it was straightforward and it was just a matter of course that would happen in every culture.
So yeah, then one area that I specialize is media theory. And Marshall McLuhan, who is a media theorist, suggests that the reason why it happened in one particular culture and not in another is because there needs to be a fertile soil for such an abstraction to take place. And what the fertile soil of ancient Greeks was a phonetic alphabet, because unlike the alphabets of Eastern cultures, phonetic alphabet offers us a higher degree of abstraction from the everyday world, since phonetic letters are completely detached from the everyday pictographical nature of our life, and McLuhan would point that the reason why China never developed the same form of formal logic as ancient Greeks did is because they never had phonetic alphabet the same way ancient Greeks had, which determined such a high level of abstraction, where the abstract entities completely detached themselves from the everyday world. What is a reaction of an analytic philosopher to such somewhat controversial ideas?
So I would want to know what other anthropologists think about that. I mean, it doesn't seem very plausible that you're going to get a similar story about mathematics.
Well, yeah, the other...
right. It's got nothing to do with the phonetic alphabet now, because the Chinese and Indians developed mathematics, but not all cultures did. So there's and that's an example of abstraction, right? Using numbers.
Exactly.
Doing mathematics is an example of abstraction. So I guess I'm kind of skeptical.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, skeptical that there's a kind of general faculty of abstraction. It gets kind of brought into being in some places and not others. So if I understood what you were saying about...
So if you're skeptical of the idea that there is the power of abstraction that takes place in one place and not in others, then how would you account for the fact that it happened in one place and not in another?
But the question is what you thought abstractly about. counting is doing mathematics involves a kind of abstraction that's clearly not related to other kinds of abstraction. I mean, because whatever McLuhan was talking about, he wasn't talking about mathematics. He was talking about some other kind of abstract thing.
Oh, he talked about the formal logic and Euclidean geometry, which you thought was an extension.
So he's talking about logic.
Yeah, formal logic and Euclidean geometry, which he thought was an extension of a phonetic alphabet. Yeah.
So that second bit also sounds improbable. Right?
Yeah.
I don't know enough. I have in the past read some about the history of mathematics, but I don't recall enough of it to or about why I feel kind of confident that as this theory about the origins of geometry, that doesn't sound right.
To move on, I want to ask you a couple of questions about epistemology. So, some of the questions that I'm going to ask you are very primitive in nature, but those are the questions that for some reason are the ones that interest me the most. So there is a form of uncomfortableness when asking those questions, but I will still do it. So, what is knowledge?
That's an extraordinarily difficult question to answer. So there is one view that's quite popular amongst analytic philosophers at the moment is that there isn't really an interesting account of knowledge in terms of other things. Knowledge is one of the kind of conceptual primitives. So you can make axioms about it. So if you know something, then it's true, for example. But there's no way of explaining knowledge in terms of other things. You start with knowledge. To take a different view that for a long time was very popular in philosophy attributed to Plato, knowledge is justified true belief. And then there's this endless debate about how you can interpret justification, truth, and belief in order for it to turn out that matches up exactly with knowledge. So I don't have a view about that. When I do epistemology, I'm not that interested in knowledge. I start with belief. I think beliefs are much more interesting.
Okay. Would you say that knowledge is a subset of belief? That since the justified true belief is the most popular theory of knowledge?
I guess that seems right. I believe lots of things, but I'm mistaken about some of them. So some of the things I believe I don't know. Whereas there are perhaps some of the things I believe I do know. In fact, surely that's right. I believe that there's some coloured pens on the desk in front of me, and surely I know that by any reasonable standard of knowledge. So perhaps that's right.
I want to ask you a following question. So when we say that a proposition is true, do you understand it as a form of correspondence? So a true proposition satisfies the one-to-one correspondence where so my pen is black. The statement is correct, is true, because it is actually black, and there's this form of correspondence between the statement and the reality. That's how you understand the theory of truth?
I'm not sure that I understand it that way at all. There's a view about truth that goes like this. Largely, truth's redundant. To say that something is true is just to say it. Right? It's true that the pen is black just in case the pen is black, right? So when I said it's true, I wasn't adding anything to the claim if I just asserted that the pen's black. Now you might say, well, why would you have a redundant predicate? And the reason for that is because it's not always redundant. So consider everything the Pope says true.
So again, everything what?
Consider the sentence, everything the Pope says is true.
Everything the Pope says is true.
I can't just drop off the is true and be left with a sentence that, the is true is not redundant in that case. Right? Whereas the sentence, the grass is green is true. I can just say the grass is green. So, put it this way, the grass is green is true. I can just drop off the is true. But in the everything the Pope says is true, I can't drop that off because then I don't have a sentence at all. And
okay. So yeah, I got it. Yeah.
Predicate is to enable you to say things like that. Right? It's not got nothing to do with correspondence. It's just that otherwise what you would be asserting was some infinite conjunction. If the Pope says that grass is green, then grass is green. And if the Pope says that cows are purple, then cows are purple. And for every possible sentence, right, that's what you don't have to do because you can say everything the Pope says is true, right? So this is a theory about the truth predicate, the way that it works, but it takes away, I think, any impulse to talk about correspondence or, there's a bunch of other kind of substantive theories about truth, and I don't believe any of them.
So truth is a property of a proposition? Is that what?
No. So I'm just telling what I'm looking at is the way that the word works, and then I'm resisting any urge to put any metaphysics on it at all.
So I just want to catch up. So we have.
So this is called a redundancy. Basically, the redundancy theory. It's true that blah. Saying that is saying no more.
Wait, you cut out.
Blah,
you cut out.
Whatever it was.
I couldn't hear you again.
Right, so let me try again. To say it's true that grass is green is to say no more and no less than grass is green.
Exactly.
Right? So the truth operator is just redundant.
Yeah.
Okay, now that can't be the whole story about truth, because why would we have it? Well, we have it because in order to say things, to give you the information that I convey when I say everything the Pope says is true, I would have to otherwise make an infinite state.
Because if you subtract the truth part, you are left with the meaningless statement. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. So the redundancy. So it's not always redundant. It's redundant in certain contexts, and then you can see its utility when you look in other contexts. That's what the truth predicate is for. So this is the theory about why we have the truth predicate. That's anti-metaphysical. It resists any urge to put any metaphysics on it whatsoever.
So we say the grass is green, and then we say it is true that grass is green, and the theoretical content of these two statements is the same.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
The word truth, what it adds to a statement is that it is basically a declarative assertion about the state of affairs. So what does it add? I guess you already answered that question.
In that case, I say it doesn't add anything, right? But you're looking in the wrong place. If you're looking at sentences of that form, it just looks like it's the pointless decoration. But when you think about sentences like everything the Pope says is true, you can see that it's not a pointless decoration because it's a convenient way of saying things that otherwise it would be enormously complicated to say. We understand what the equivalent thing is, and we adopt the truth predicate as a kind of convenient way of increasing the expressive power of our language. It allows us to say things that otherwise would be really hard to say. But there's no metaphysics that goes along with it. That's the view. That's the view I like.
So when we say the grass is green, what in what case is that statement true? The natural answer is, well, if grass is actually green.
Yeah.
Well,
if grass is green.
So does that necessitate a form of representational theory of subject-object distinction?
So suppose you say the grass is green. Oh, let's pick a different example.
Yeah.
One where it's now let's pick something that's not trivial. I don't know. Let's say Australia won the match last night.
Again?
So is that a good assertion for me to have made?
So you provided
depends
another
what-
example. Just can you repeat the example? I didn't catch it.
Okay, sorry. Australia won the match last night. There was a World Cup cricket match last night against South Africa that Australia won.
I have so I have no idea about.
It doesn't. Yeah, it's okay. You don't have to understand the context. Right?
Yeah.
It's just if I say to you, Australia won the match.
Okay.
You can now talk about my assertion, and you can talk about whether Australia won the match or not. Right? You'll reject my assertion if you think they didn't win. Right? And otherwise, you'll accept it. And we can talk about this in terms of truth too, if you like. But when you ask me, is it true that Australia won the match? You just asked me whether Australia won the match. Right? And whether they did depends on what happens yesterday. I mean, depends whether they did, right?
So they won. Okay, so let's follow that example. So they won the match. It is official. You say that they won the match, and your statement's true. So the correspondence holds then.
I'm thinking that you don't need to suppose that there's a correspondence, because the correspondence theorists, when they fill it out, there's all these kind of details, right, that have to go into the theory that make the theory cumbersome and maybe not very plausible or whatever. What I'm thinking is that you don't need any of that in order to explain our talk. Maybe it's because of the question about what correspondence means.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So because that's what I have in mind. So it's like what makes.
I can talk about what happened last night, right? I can talk about what happened last night, and when I'm talking about what happened last night, I can tell you false things and I can tell you true things. That is, I can say things that happened. I can talk about things that did happen and things that didn't happen, so on.
And what? I guess my question.
Maybe in some sense, you're now going to want to talk about correspondence.
No. So what I'm annoying you with is to try and ask you. It's like, what is it exactly that makes my statement true? What is it that confers truthfulness to my statement? In virtue of what?
So you might say, well, it depends what happened last night, right? There was a game played, and
okay,
so imagine we didn't know the result, right? And we're considering the claim that Australia won. Well, assuming that the game was completed, either Australia won or South Africa won. So if Australia won, then when you say Australia won, you'll be speaking truly. If South Africa won, then when you're speaking, you'll be speaking. If you say Australia won, you'll be speaking falsely.
So wouldn't that necessitate?
Does it? Does that necessitate anything that deserves to be called the correspondence theory of truth? I'm not sure.
But wouldn't that necessitate some form of a modified version of Cartesian metaphysics, where there are subjects and there is an objective world, and we have images and representations of that objective world, and the objective world carries on independent of us, but then we can inspect them. Isn't this all this baggage about the subject-object distinction and the external world and our internal minds? Isn't that whole baggage tucked in this idea?
So I'm not sure, right? All I said was we can talk about what happened last night at the particular ground in India where the match was played. And I don't think that it doesn't seem to me that there's anything kind of being smuggled in, any heavy-duty metaphysics being smuggled into that. And to deny that would be very odd, I think.
Oh, yeah, to deny that would be very odd. It's just, I mean, it is clear to me that there are debates about what makes a statement true. I mean, so
that's true too.
yeah. So I guess to move on, although I want to ask you an adjacent question. So when we say that, well, my opinion is objectively true, well, yours is just your subjective opinion. Well, what is it really that we're talking about with this objective subjective thing?
Right. So that's a good question. It would. I mean, there are examples you can bring up that you might think give some substance to it. So suppose, for example, that we're arguing about a particular phenomenon in Newtonian mechanics, and I've asked the Academy of Sciences, the expert physicists, and I have their view. And you've made up something off the top of your head that's wildly different from that. And now we ask about the kind of relative worthiness of our opinions. It seems that my opinion has a lot more going for it than yours does. And does that give you a kind of objectivity and subjectivity? Maybe.
So, a lot more going on. What?
A lot more going for it.
For
right.
it. Okay.
Yeah.
So my
not all opinions are equal.
So my statement has more supporters, as in not like human supporters, but as in supporters as in.
So what I'm thinking in that case is that there's a distribution of expertise, right, about particular subject matters. And if you're coordinating your opinion to the experts, that your opinion's got a lot more going for it. I'm not saying it's guaranteed to be true, because sometimes there's an expert consensus that turns out to be mistaken. But if you want to use a different vocabulary here, there are some things that some people know about and other people don't. Right? And if you're coordinating your opinion to the people who've got the knowledge, then you're going to be doing better than the people who are just making stuff up. And there's plenty of examples of people just making stuff up on the internet in the contemporary world. So I would think that in that case, while I don't think that let's suppose that the creationist is a young Earth creationist and they have a particular theory that grew out of the stuff that was done by people who weren't biologists in the United States in the 1920s. Their opinion doesn't have much going for it, and the opinion of a person who's taking their views from scientists who work on various parts of evolutionary theory. So the opinion of the creationist will have less going for it. But it's not that the opinion of the person who's taking their views from the scientists is getting everything right. There's lots of stuff in evolutionary theory that's still not been worked out. There's lots of stuff we don't know about the history of life on Earth. It may well be that there's a bunch of stuff in those opinions that's got wrong. So sort of going absolutely objective and absolutely subjective is getting it wrong. But there's definitely a scale of better and worse, and this is a good illustration of it. There's more going for the opinion of the person who's coordinating their views to the views of the world biological scientist than to the person who's coordinating their views to what a hydrologist and a mechanical engineer said in America in the 1920s.
All right. So one more question that I want to move on now. One more question that I have about epistemology is the following. So in popular culture, I guess, in recent times, with the popularity of Jordan Peterson, there was a lot of talk about postmodernism and postmodern philosophy, although in a very not necessarily trustworthy fashion, because when philosophy becomes a matter of internet discussions, mostly what happens is that you get a very dumbed down strawman versions of philosophical schools. But I guess since the postmodernism became somewhat more popular and controversial, I want to ask you a question that I would think would naturally follow from a postmodern school of thought towards an analytic philosopher such as you are. Namely, that a question would be like this that I have written down here. Do you think that environment and the language delimit one's epistemology to such a high degree that claims of objective, transhistorical knowledge become impossible?
So, if objective means certain, if to claim objectivity is to claim that you can't be mistaken, then nobody should be making claims to those things, I don't think, except in very special cases. So, in the sciences, there's stuff that really is settled, right? So, what does Newtonian mechanics say about this particular type of engine, right? Maybe we can think of that as kind of just objective, maybe. But most of the stuff that scientists talk about isn't of that standing, right? And if what's required is certainty, being able to say that then it's not going to be objective. But this isn't really one way of thinking about this, the way that lots of analytic philosophers would put it, is the only things that you're going to give, that you can give credence one to, are things about which you couldn't possibly be mistaken. Because once your credence is at one, if you're revising your beliefs by Bayesian updating, you can't move away from one. Right, so there's something irrational about giving credence one to anything that you couldn't possibly be mistaken about. That just means that there has to be a certain amount of, let's call it epistemic modesty. Just
So, yeah, but
making claims to certainty.
So what I guess would be the a postmodern thinking that goes through such a question is you can have a perfectly operational theory of physics that would allow you to make an atom bomb or make an engine work and so on and so forth, but there is one function of it, namely that you can make things work. But what they would have in mind is that your understanding of it is so framed with cultural temperament, language, the zeitgeist, and so on and so forth, that it's just one discursive practice among other discursive practices. It stands out because of its grandiosity. It's just that it can give us big airplanes, big trains, big rockets, but it just works. And working doesn't necessarily mean that you apprehend some form of transhistorical truth. What would be your reaction to this line of thought?
So, I'm not sure what you mean by transhistorical.
As in what?
If what you mean, because there's a question about, a different question to the one about things. One is whether you know everything important about particular topic or thing or whatever. And the idea that you know everything important about a particular topic is also one that's going to be fraught almost always. Again, there's some epistemic humility that's going to be required, right? So in the case of a bomb, right? It's not just a question of making them; it's a question about where they get exploded, for example.
Yeah, I mean that's what I meant when I said that it works. It explodes, but what they would have in mind is a form of language and the thought that goes into it, and the formulation of laws of thermodynamics and the language that is used in formulation, and then them going on to find a correspondence between the language that physicists use and, for example, a cultural temperament of the West, or the linguistic properties of, for example, German language or English language within which. So, like, would that create a form of discomfort if someone finds an element of specific cultural temperament in a discipline as objective as physics?
I guess I think the answer to that question is yes, because the standard rhetoric here is that physics is the same in Pakistan as it is in Australia, as it is in anywhere else, right? And I was reading some stuff today discussing the idea that there might be, say, Islamic physics, which was different from physics as we currently have it. And it seems like there is something uncomfortable about that thought. So, and this goes back to the point I was making about, I'm thinking that there's a kind of global consensus amongst the expert biologists, the kind of people who get elected to properly constituted scientific academies.
Yeah, well, I mean, postmodern thinkers wouldn't count. Well, I mean, they would say that, well, they are so involved that they're of course blind to their cultural presuppositions. It's just so happened that West, with its power of globalization, convinced other nations that their rendition and their formulation is the correct one. But it's just an illusion of modern globalization. In actuality, it's just a domination of one cultural temperament over other cultures. And one philosopher who would be an ancestor to such a postmodern thought would be someone like Oswald Spengler, for example, who did claim that there is Arabian mathematics, there is Western mathematics, there is Greek mathematics, and those mathematics all are different manifestations of different cultural temperaments or different prime symbols of different cultures. And that...
Right, whereas other people are going to say, well, look, mathematics is just mathematics. There's no alternative to the Pythagorean theorem that's thrown up by other cultures. There's no culture that says, that one's false, right? That's not a theorem. It's an alternative, right? In mathematics especially, that doesn't happen. It may be that what you focus on is different. So maybe one culture develops an account of knots than another. I mean, it's just silly, but and then another culture develops a theory of groups. But it's not that counting or basic principles of geometry have any cultural variation in them.
So
that would be
okay.
The kind of standard view amongst mathematicians, I would think, everywhere. And so then there's this question which you raised: could this be the could this be a result of globalisation? But I'm not sure that's right. So there was, if you go back to the ancient world and you look at the interchanges between mathematicians in Persia and India and Greece and so on, it's not like you get different results in the different cultures.
You don't get different results, but what?
You don't get one group proving P and the other group proving not P. That just doesn't happen.
So
in mathematics.
Yeah. So what Oswald Spengler, who was a math teacher, by the way, would say is that you might arrive to the same conclusions, but the method would be different, and the method would also be determined by cultural temperament, and also the paradigmatic theories would be. So, for example, Oswald Spengler would say that Greek, no matter how much time you gave it, would have never developed infinitesimal calculus, because Spengler would metaphysically suggest that ancient Greeks never had a form of impulse towards infinity and striving towards infinity. And so Spengler would say that far Western North European society is obsessed with infinity and form of what he calls Western society a Faustian society. And Faust is the character who trades his soul for knowledge, and he would claim that, well, the reason why they developed infinitesimal calculus and rockets and so upward soaring Gothic cathedrals and long-range weapons is because everything works under this cultural temperament of infinity, whereas moderation and a form of a balance and harmony is the body is what motivates the Greeks. So, for example, but I would understand that for you that would be too poetic. You wouldn't take that seriously.
So, well, I actually think that Spengler's just wrong. So, Archimedes' method of exhaustion is very nearly calculus. It's not like the Greeks didn't have the capacity to move in that direction. They not only did, but they exercised it, according to me. But that might be a kind of controversial reading of the history of mathematics, but I think that clearly Spengler's reading of it is controversial.
I find it interesting to read out a quote for you, and I would like to see what would be your reaction to an author that is so radically different from your modus operandi, and I would like to see your reaction to it, if you're okay with it. I want to just read you a quote from another author, which is slightly connected to what we talked about. Okay, so the quote goes on like this: European philosophy was based on the logocentric principle corresponding to the principle of exclusion, the differentiating Greek diaresis. All this corresponds strictly to the masculine attitude and reflects a patriarchal, authoritative, vertical, and hierarchical order of being and knowledge. The masculine approach to reality imposes order and the principle of exclusivity everywhere. That is perfectly manifested in Aristotle's logic, where the principles of identity and exclusion are put in the central position in the normative manner of thinking. A is equal to A, not equal to not A. This identity excludes non-identity and vice versa. What would be your reaction to what do you think? What do you think this person? Where do you think this person is coming from? What is your reaction? What would be a reaction of someone like you who's a very pedantic, analytic thinker to such idea?
There was a lot. It's kind of hard to respond to it. But one thing is that when I was a graduate student, I wrote an essay about Aristotle on women. And there's no question that his views about women were highly problematic, right? So whether you
why was it problematic?
So So there's this stuff, I can't remember where it is, which Aristotelian text it's in, where women are sort of like half-baked men. They're not fully rational. Their rational capacities are not fully operative. There's a whole lot of stuff like that in Aristotle.
What if it was the case with ancient Greek females? You don't think
that seems incredibly unlikely.
Yeah.
Seems like that's something that should get minuscule credence.
Okay. So, yeah, then.
Right. So, whether it's the case that his attitude towards women can be bred off what he says about logic seems unlikely to me to be true. So this is what I was thinking in response to what you said, that there's something masculine about a kind of principle of identity, and I assume the principle of contradiction.
What it means is not necessarily Aristotle's attitude, but the spirit of Western consciousness, form of rational consciousness, not just Aristotle.
So you can still see it in the Enlightenment, right?
Yeah.
It's not like the views of Kant and Hume about women are any better than Aristotle's, right? So, I'm not sure, right, that we can connect these two topics, even if you take the broader sweep. So we're not just talking about Aristotle; we're talking about a very long period of time, that there's any particular connection between appalling things that all of those people said about women, and at least in Aristotle's case, because Kant and him were both not very good at logic, and said about logic what Aristotle said about logic.
And what do you think is the school of thought that such line of reasoning might be coming from?
So you mean when you read this out, who wrote it?
The idea that the Western consciousness structure is patriarchal and form of left hemisphere oriented and this.
So I really don't know. It could be coming from almost anywhere, because it's true that the history of the West is patriarchal. That's true.
But patriarchal, he doesn't mean patriarchal in the sense of politics. He means patriarchal in the sense of its reasoning, irrespective of whether the reasoning is done by a female or a male. The female Western philosopher would think in the same fashion. What he means is that the fundamental modus operandi of Western philosophy is such and such. The fact that you can have a female philosopher, she will think in that manner too. She will make everything.
So the idea now is that there's kind of something like styles. You said modus operandi.
That's what he means, right? Exactly.
So one of the things that's now going to be tricky is to determine who counts as a Western philosopher and who doesn't in this. So consider Nietzsche. Are we going to count him as someone who thinks in this style?
Although his philosophy is extremely anti-Platonic, the fundamental property still holds. He excludes lots of people who won't be able to conform to his theory. Therefore, his understanding of the solution is exclusory. There is a thin line between the Übermensch and the current state of humanity, and lots of people are going to be excluded from that by virtue of that thin line. Nietzsche also is a very aggressive in his assertions of what he considers to be a true understanding of the world. He also, when he speaks about other philosophers, he never tries to synthesize them, but he excludes them vehemently. So this form of exclusory modus operandi that this person is accusing West of still holds in Nietzsche, although he is more poetic and unsystematic.
I'm trying to think of other examples of people. If you think that there's a single modus operandi, way that, Nietzsche's writings stand out as looking very different from the writings of, say, John Stuart Mill or Bertrand Russell or about Kant. Yeah, so I'd want to think about it more, to think if I can see if I can find better examples of people from the West who you might think don't fit that characterisation.
Yeah,
that was kind of my initial response. That's why I thought, okay, I'll test this out, and I'll start asking about people.
Well, Nietzsche, I think,
because there's a hypothesis of uniformity there that doesn't strike me as being obviously true.
Exactly. Quite surprisingly, this is not coming from a Western feminist, but rather it comes from a Russian crypto-fascist form of anti-Western thinker, Alexander Dugin. It was interesting to see your reaction to such somewhat outlandish idea. Well, I think we need to move.
In some ways, Spengler kind of fits that characterization too.
Oswald Spengler would agree with that. Oswald Spengler would agree with the statement that I just
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, even Martin Heidegger to some degree would agree, because Martin Heidegger accuses Western philosophy of operating under a particular modus operandi, that is the presence at hand understanding, whereby we have these subjects who apprehend objects in this undifferentiated theoretical phase space, where when I'm thinking about a chair, I'm a detached subject, a form of windowless monad, and I'm apprehending a chair in a decontextualized XY coordinate system. And what Heidegger then tries to do is that, well, I'm going to contextualize philosophy back into the referential totality of the world, where I won't conceive human subjectivity as a Cartesian subject, which is detached and some form of social atom, which is deworlded from a contextual framework, but I'm going to conceive the essence of humanity as Dasein, that is an entity who is always involved in tasks, who is always engaged in a flow of social network and cultural network. And what Heidegger then does is to say that, well, the one mistake that all the philosophers have made is to equate being with a capital B with beings with lowercase b. And they were finding the substance of beings and the essence of beings in a wrong place. And what I'm going to do is that I'm going to determine what the being is with a capital B. And the capital being is the a priori enigma, the pre-ontological and pre-epistemological understanding of being that enables, stabilizes, and makes intelligible that which we understand to be true and that which we understand to be correct. And then Heidegger would say that there is a history of being. Ancient Greeks understand being differently. Then Romans understand it differently. There is a different understanding of being in scholastic period. Then there is a different understanding of being in modernity. And finally, there is a different understanding of being in current epoch, which is a technological understanding of being. And then Heidegger awaits a new understanding of being that would emancipate Western society from this suffocating technological form of inframing understanding of being, where everything is understood as a resource to be put to an exploitation and work. So such thinkers mostly approach philosophical matters from a zeitgeist form of perspective, which is not, I guess, characteristic of an analytic approach.
It depends a little bit what you think is being reacted against here, because I think amongst analytic philosophers there's been something of a social turn in the last 20 or 30 years. So a lot of epistemology is social epistemology, whereas, if you go back 30 years, people were obsessed with things like the Gettier problem, and that was a kind of individual question. So it depends, right? Whether what Heidegger was it depends a bit what Heidegger was reacting against, whether you think that contemporary analytic philosophers are still lining up with it.
So Heidegger, I would say, would react against the way you framed your understanding of the world. So if you say to Heidegger that the fundamental unit of the universe is a thing and it is composed of things and events, he would have an allergy to it. He would say that that's basically the perennial mistake that Western philosophers make. No, it comes from a form of machination whereby there is a form of user interface illusion whereby we conceive universe as being composed of individual building blocks that we can then manipulate and put to work, and actually this serves a particular purpose. And a more correct understanding of being that he would propose, which in analytic philosophy would correspond to Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophies, that actually there is no such thing as universe, but actually we are, all there is network of the referential totality, instead of it being just made up of individual things and discrete events and entities. That is the line of reasoning that he would reject, I guess.
I've never been tempted by Whitehead, as you can probably imagine.
Yeah.
But then Whitehead was part of the West.
Whitehead was what?
Part of the West. He's part of the Western tradition.
Oh yeah, but it's the 20th century, I guess, was a form of reaction against the dominant mode of Western philosophy, because you have all those thinkers, from Frankfurt School, French postmodernism, Spengler, Heidegger, and all of them react against the dominant. You have Jacques Derrida, who, for example, would claim that you have a logocentric / phallogocentric modus operandi in the West, and then you have to deconstruct it, and so on and so forth. And one thing, the whole reason why I'm bringing this up in this conversation is that what they rebel or react against is still there in analytic philosophy, I think, and that's why I'm bringing it up right now. So, but I don't think that you will ever find it actually interesting or worth considering. So
possibly not. I mean, when I was a student, I did read quite a bit of a range of 20th century sources that would not be thought of as part of analytic philosophy. I mean, that's standard for university education, Australia in philosophy, I would have thought. So there were subjects that were called contemporary French philosophy, pre-German philosophy, on. And so I know a tiny bit, but not much, about most of the things that you mentioned: the Frankfurt School, Derrida, Foucault, Husserl, Heidegger. So what did I read? There's that little book, What is Being? Is that what it's called?
Heidegger's work?
Anyway, yeah, there's a small book of Heidegger's, which is about being. I forget what it's called. Which I
What is being? I don't remember. Maybe there's an essay, what is being, but I don't remember that particular. Being and Time is the most popular of the. So
yeah, sure. That's a big book.
Big book, yeah. What is being?
As an undergraduate.
I can't recall that one.
Okay, so I'm misremembering the title then.
So you mentioned Nietzsche, and I will use that opportunity. What would be a reaction of, someone, as logically and as analytically oriented as you, when you read someone as, honest? I would say the first reaction is that guy is somewhat poetic, but what would your reaction be to someone like Nietzsche, if you read it, of course, if you ever read it?
So I did. When I went to graduate school,
which work?
Semester for. So I did a course with Alexander Neymar, and we read the entire corpus, one book a week. Read the corpus.
One book a week.
I've written I've read all of Nietzsche's. I mean, I won't claim to have done it in great depth, but I've read all of his published works.
Okay.
When I was in graduate school, and I was a fan before that. So when I was at high school, I had a copy of you probably wouldn't know, but in the United States, Walter Kaufman published this kind of the Viking Library, the portable Nietzsche.
Yeah, portable Nietzsche. No, I know.
All of Zarathustra and bits out of, I think only bits out of Twilight of the Idols, and Good and Evil, and so on. And I'd read all of that before I got out of school. I found it all very interesting.
What do you think of him now?
I can't say that I engaged very much with what he does. When I've had things to say about him in my writings, they've mostly been negative. Like he has some cruel things to say about George Eliot, and I've commented on that. But I think that although it's like lots of things that I picked up and toyed with for a while and then put down, it didn't leave much of a lasting impression.
What would your reaction be if such culturally oriented thinkers attempted to situate and contextualize your approach, that is the minimalist approach, if they tried to situate that in a particular temporal framework, namely that actually it is a product of a particular epoch, and that particular epoch has a cyclical nature, and it already happened. So to read you a quote, so when Heidegger is talking about a technological understanding of being, and according to Heidegger, the technological understanding of being is Gestell, which in English is in framing, whereby everything is understood as a form of inventory, where you circumscribe everything into a particular purpose, namely to yield power and nothing else. The world loses its poetic, philosophical nature. Everything is a resource to be put into work. And Heidegger would accuse you of being and your philosophy of being a product of technological understanding of being. And here's why. Let me read a quote from his popular essay, Question Concerning Technology. So then the quote goes, "This setting upon that challenges the energies of nature is an expediting, and in two ways. It expedites in that it unlocks and exposes, yet that expediting is always itself directed from the beginning toward furthering something else, i.e. toward driving onto the maximum yield at the minimum expense." So he's talking about expediting as in what is the primary modus operandi of the technological being, and the primary goal is striving towards the maximum yield at the minimum expense. And from that line of reasoning, it would follow that, you know, there is a resemblance of how engineering and technology is done and how you approach metaphysics. Namely, that if you want to do good engineering, you need least amount of working technology, but you want to construct as effective sort of buildings or machines as possible. So this form of utilitarianism or practicality with which you approach and evaluate metaphysical theories, Heidegger would accuse you of being a product of a technological zeitgeist. What would you?
Yeah, so that's kind of interesting. I mean, you might think that it would be kind of interesting to think about neoliberalism in this context, and to think about the way that, at least in the West, government has kind of decayed over well, at least since Thatcher and Reagan, right? And I might say what Heidegger's saying is a fair criticism of kind of, you know, we can apply it to neoliberalism.
Exactly, you've got it exactly. Yes. But I don't think that you would agree to the idea that your method might be unconsciously a product of a technological zeitgeist, of course.
So no, I'm inclined to think not. But one thing that you can't do is know what future developments are going to be. And maybe, if I'm remembered at all, that's exactly what people will say was a product of his time. That's what you end up saying about most people. Right? If you go back and part of the reason why I mentioned Nietzsche is because some people say, well, you know, he's kind of this untimely figure, but actually he was very much a product of Romanticism, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm sure there are all kinds of limitations that if anybody was interested, at some future point, it will be obvious applied to me and my thinking.
Okay, well, I mean that's fair.
That seems kind of obvious, right?
That's obvious. But so what I would say is that the accusation, to fortify that accusation, what could be said is that your approach resembles the tendency that Western technology embodies. And here's what I have in mind. So there is another thinker who is inspired by Oswald Spengler, British historian Arnold Toynbee. And what Arnold Toynbee does is that he asks a question, well, do we actually have a good metric of progress? And he goes on to suggest that, well, actually we don't. Most of the metrics have serious problems. Because if you approach it differently, then it's no longer progress. So Toynbee then goes on to say, well, actually, I've got one. I've stumbled upon it. Okay, so it goes like this: the metric of progress is what he calls etherealization, and what it means is that as time goes, matter is minimized, but the output is maximized. So basically, software swallows hardware, and you can do more and more with less and less. With the advent of technology, what basically technology does is that it allows you to expand your area of power, but the ways within which you are expanding your area of power is itself shrinking. And in 20th century technology is a really good example of that, because we have computers that are getting smaller and smaller, yet they are doing better and better things. So etherealization here points to this idea that, well, the device with which we do things is being etherealized and dematerialized. However, the what it can do is being expanded. And the resemblance here would be that you're striving towards that form of minimization when it comes to metaphysical theories. Let's have less and less commitments because, the laptop that I'm having has way more power than a big personal computer. It has less commitments, it takes up less space, but it does more and more. So do you think that resemblance of technology and your approach is just, it's just a superficial resemblance, and I'm just chasing a...
Yeah. So that's what I'd be inclined to say. I think, there's, to quote an analytic philosopher, Nelson Goodman, everything's like everything else in ever so many ways, and unlike everything else in ever so many ways. So you can, what would be, I guess the question that I would want to ask is what kinds of evidence it would take to establish that really there was a significant impact of the kind of ideas that Toynbee was articulating there on the way that I think about metaphysical theorising. Unsurprisingly, I'm not convinced that there's a very close link there, but it is kind of interesting. I will certainly think about it.
Great, that was really great. I just want to ask one question that my cousin who studies theology wanted to ask you, and then we can wrap this up. I'm really thankful for your time. So he studies theology and he read your book, Atheism, and what he wants to ask you is basically, does naturalism have solid basis for justifying ethical beliefs?
I think so, but this is controversial. So I think that that a lot about ethics is just universal cross-culturally. So there couldn't be a human society that didn't have a principle that says you shouldn't kill. But of course, the principle stated like that isn't true. With every society allows exceptions, and they disagree about what the exceptions are. But no society is going to operate if it says, yeah, your neighbours, your children, your parents are open slavery, kill them whenever you want, right? And the same goes for other parts of morality too, right? So you shouldn't lie, except when you're allowed to, and we disagree a bit cross-culturally about what the exceptions are. We don't disagree about the central principle, and so on. And where do these come from? They're constraints on having society at all, right? There couldn't be human society if you didn't have people who lived according to a bunch of these principles. That's why they're universal, and there's no problem that then arises about these principles, as far as I can see. Maybe you could hate humanity and wish that it would disappear, right? If you think that humanity is worth persevering with, then you're just committed to these principles because you can't have human society without them. That's roughly the form of kind of answer I want to give.
Yeah, I guess what Alexander was asking is whether naturalism can have justification for those ethical assertions.
Right. Well, I've kind of suggested that if you want to frame it as a principle with justification, these principles are just necessarily true. You shouldn't kill, you shouldn't lie, so on. Of course, we can imagine creatures, well, there are creatures, right? Imagine an intelligent tiger. Tigers are solitary creatures that don't live in society. There's no reason why, if I was a tiger, I should see myself bound by those rules. But given that I'm a human being, I have to see myself as bound by those rules. And of course, some people don't, but we think of them as in some ways kind of not fully human. I'm thinking about psychopaths or whatever.
Okay. That's fair. So I think I have taken more time than expected, and I entered the flow state, so I lost the consciousness of time. So anyway, Mr. Oppy, I mean, I have no words. I am so thankful. I think that this conversation was extremely productive, and I can't express my gratitude. Thank you very much, Mr. Oppy. I've learned. Actually,
thanks for inviting me on.
I've learned a lot from this conversation. So thank you again.